The town of Dry Hollow didn't speak much. Not of what mattered, anyhow. It was the kind of place where boots did most of the talking, where bruises were called accidents, and kindness, when it did show its face, came quiet and late. She stepped into morning like someone walking across glass. Light barely touched her, the way her shawl was pulled tight around her bruised cheek. She carried a basket too heavy for her frame and moved with the stiff grace of someone who'd learned not to wince in public. Folks in town looked away. Some with guilt. Some with that old habit of pretending things weren't what they were. He saw her. From across the road, leaning against a porch post like it was holding him up, the widower Cowboy stood in the hush of dawn. His name was whispered now and then, mostly by older men at the saloon, saying he used to run cattle before his wife died. Since then, he'd barely spoken. Just worked his small patch of land and watched the world from behind steady eyes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He didn't drink, didn't fight, didn't chase women. But Lord, he noticed her. And how could he not? She moved like someone who had once known joy and was now walking with its ghost. Her hair was always tied back loose, never with ribbons, never with care, like it didn't matter anymore. That morning, he noticed the limp was sharper than usual, her right foot dragging just enough to make a scuffing sound against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. She passed the mercantile, and the owner, Mr. Darby, offered a pitiful nod and nothing more. The bruises, faint but blooming along her jaw, were impossible to miss. Still, he said nothing. Neither did the preacher who crossed the street, nor the woman sweeping dust off the stoop of the dress shop. Silence wasn't just common in Dry Hollow. It was law. He didn't move from the porch. Just let the brim of his hat tilt lower, his fingers twitching against the worn edge of the post. She turned the corner, disappeared down the alley beside the boarding house where her in-laws lived, a house too proud and too cold, full of lace curtains and the smell of whiskey. The town still called it hers, but the truth was, it hadn't been hers since the day her husband took fever and left her behind with nothing but debts and in-laws who said her prayers must have been weak. Inside that house, folks said things happened. Things best not spoken of. Plates broken. Screaming behind closed doors. Some nights, you could hear it down the road. The man who used to be her brother-in-law, a red-faced brute with a temper that rode the edge of madness, believed women should be kept humble. His sister, a narrow-faced woman with eyes like dull coins, believed grief should be punished. Between the two of them, the widow lived like a ghost in her own home. Cleaning, cooking, serving, enduring. That morning, she came out again before noon with a bundle of mended clothes under her arm. Her lips were split. Her eyes refused to meet anyone's. The cowboy had not moved. He watched her like he was memorizing the way sorrow bent a body, how it curved her shoulders inward and made her steps silent as prayer. When she passed him this time, her eyes flickered up for half a second. He nodded. That was all. But her fingers clutched the cloth bundle tighter, like the gesture had touched something inside her she didn't know how to name. She vanished down the hill toward the river, maybe to wash or maybe to breathe where no one could hear her do it. The day wore on slow. Sunlight stretched itself thin, and clouds piled like judgment on the horizon. When she returned, her dress was wet to the knees. Mud stained the hem. A single strip of lace on her sleeve had torn. She didn't seem to notice. That evening, the shouting started just after the town lamps were lit. No one looked up from their dinner plates. No one stood. Not even when the crashing followed. A chair, maybe. A voice breaking into sobs. A man yelling about ungratefulness. But he stood. The cowboy stepped off his porch like a man who hadn't decided what to do, only that doing nothing was no longer an option. He crossed the empty street, boots steady, coat fluttering at his sides. He reached her gate and paused. It was quiet now. Too quiet. He turned back. Didn't knock. Didn't speak. Just stood there for a moment and looked up at the house where the curtain shifted as someone peeked from inside. Then he walked back home. That night, something changed. It wasn't loud or large, just the way the wind settled differently on the town, like the silence had become too thick to breathe through. Near midnight, she stepped outside again. Alone. Her cheek swollen, one wrist bandaged with torn fabric. She sat on the porch of the boarding house, hands in her lap. Her bare feet touched the cold planks, and for a while, she just stared out into the dark like it held something kinder than what waited behind her. He lit a lantern. Not for her. Not because he expected her to see it. But he left it in the window like a promise. A soft light in the dark. A whisper that said, "I see you." And though the wind picked up, and the world kept turning like it didn't care about her pain, for the first time in weeks, she didn't flinch when the door creaked behind her. She didn't go in. She stayed on the porch, wrapped tighter in her shawl, eyes fixed on that single light across the street. Somewhere deep in the dark, the town exhaled. And the story, hers, his, and ours, finally began. The rain came softly at first, as if the sky itself were testing its own sorrow. Dry Hollow had not seen rain in near 3 weeks, and the thirsty dust welcomed it with quiet, hissing sips. But for her, the rain was no blessing. It soaked her hem before she'd made it halfway to the church. She didn't carry a parasol. Her shawl clung heavy around her shoulders. Mud painted the edges of her boots as she trudged along the back lane, avoiding the front road where curious eyes waited behind curtain slits. She arrived late, slipping into the last pew like a shadow, unnoticed save for the cowboy who had already been seated at the far end, 3 rows ahead. He didn't turn. Didn't need to. He felt her like one might feel the sun warm their back without looking skyward. The preacher spoke of patience and punishment, some vague tale of wayward wives and divine retribution. Her hands folded in her lap, pale and trembling. A bruise peeked from the neckline of her dress, a faded yellow bloom now, older than the fresh ones that dotted her arms. Halfway through the sermon, she stood and left. No one stopped her. No one even blinked. But he rose as well, slow and quiet, tipping his hat to no one in particular as he stepped out into the rain behind her. He didn't follow. Just watched from the church steps as she disappeared down the slope toward the cottonwoods, where the world dipped into silence. She stayed out there for near an hour. When she returned to the boarding house, she paused briefly by the porch, as if unsure whether to enter. Then she vanished inside like smoke swallowed by an old chimney. He returned home and lit his stove. His cabin smelled of cedar and damp earth. A place that remembered silence and didn't mind it. He moved to the cupboard, took down a small cloth bundle, a leftover spool of blue thread, a handful of dried apples from the last harvest, and a strip of muslin. It wasn't much, but it was all he had to offer that wouldn't carry shame. He waited until the streets grew quiet, then crossed the road and left the bundle at her door without knocking. The next morning, her porch was swept clean. A sign. He stood by his barn, watching as she emerged carrying a bucket toward the pump. The shawl was still wrapped tight, but there was no fresh bruise on her face that day. Her eyes flickered across the road. Met his. Just briefly. She nodded. A thread had been tied. The days stretched long and hushed. He worked the fields with deliberate rhythm, pausing only when the wind shifted toward the boarding house. She kept to herself but no longer rushed past him. Once, she returned from town with flour and sugar, and he noticed her shoulders no longer hunched quite so deep. Still, the town watched. One afternoon, she stepped into the dressmaker's shop, hoping to mend a hem, and emerged pale and silent, the whispers inside having pierced deeper than needles. The dressmaker, old and proud, had asked if she were taking hand-me-downs from the cowboy now, and whether she was paying for them in ways the Lord wouldn't bless. She didn't return to town for 3 days. The in-laws, sensing her withdrawal, grew bold again. The red-faced brother dragged her out by the arm on the 4th evening, shouting about dignity and duty. She fell to the ground outside the house, not crying, just still, so very still. People on the porch across the street sat frozen. But not him. The cowboy crossed the road. No gun. No words. He walked straight toward the man and stopped just a few feet away. Rain had returned, light but steady, drumming on the brim of his hat. The brother stared back, eyes wide, unsure if this was the moment he'd always feared. But the cowboy said nothing, just looked at him, and then down at her. She sat in the mud, hands scraped, dress soaked. He offered no hand, just nodded, slow and deliberate. She stood on her own. The in-law spat, cursed, then stumbled back inside. She didn't follow. Instead, she stepped past the cowboy and walked down the street, head high, though her legs trembled with every step. That night, a small wooden box appeared on her porch. Inside it, 2 tin buttons, a polished stone, and a hand-carved hairpin shaped like a feather. The kind of things a man might whittle when he doesn't know how to speak love. She left cornbread on his steps the next morning. He returned the dish with a bundle of coffee beans and no note. A rhythm began. No one called it courtship. It wasn't. Not yet. It was something quieter. Safer. She began sitting on her porch during evenings when the sky blushed gold and the air was full of crickets. He would sit on his own porch across the road, silent, rocking slow, hat tilted just enough to see her without making it a spectacle. One night, as the sun slipped low, she finally spoke. The wind carried it just enough for him to hear. "Heard you used to have a wife." He didn't answer. Not right away. Then, after a long breath. "She liked to hum while she cooked. Haven't heard a tune like that in years." The widow looked down at her lap, fingers twisting a threadbare edge of fabric. "I used to sing. Before the world got too loud." He watched her. Quiet. Then said, low as rain on dry earth, "Sometimes the loudest thing in the world is someone treating you like you matter." She didn't speak again that night. But she stayed on the porch long after darkness fell. Another week passed. Her garden, once overgrown and dying, showed signs of tending. A patch cleared. A row of lavender planted. She began walking with a softer step, as if her body had begun remembering how it once belonged to someone kind. Then the boy came. Eli, the paper boy, no more than 12, ran up her steps one morning with a bloodied nose. She knelt beside him. Listened. His father had taken a belt to him for spilling milk. She cleaned his face, offered him bread, and told him he could rest on her porch any time. When the cowboy heard, he didn't speak. But that evening, he walked to the boy's house and stood outside without a word. Just stood. The next morning, Eli's father left town for work and never returned. The widow began humming again. Not loudly. Just enough for those closest to hear. By now, the town had drawn its own conclusions. Some whispered they were already sharing more than glances. That he'd surely take her in soon. Others said it wasn't proper. That a woman like her ought to leave town altogether. The in-laws tightened their grip. She was forbidden from going to town alone. Forbidden from stepping on the porch after dusk. The beatings resumed, quieter now, more calculated. Bruises beneath sleeves. Scratches behind ears. Wounds meant to shame, not be seen. One night, she didn't appear on the porch. Nor the next. The cowboy waited. Lantern lit. Nothing. On the third night, he crossed the road and knocked. No answer. But he heard movement. A soft step. Then stillness. He left a cloth bundle anyway. Inside, a small tin of salve, a spool of thread, and a note that read only, "Still here." The next morning, her door creaked open. She stepped onto the porch, arms marked, lips cut, but standing. And in her hands, the cloth he'd left, now stitched into a small blue pillow. She set it on the bench, then sat beside it. He stepped outside his own cabin, rocked once, twice, watched the wind pick up a curl of her hair and place it gently behind her ear. Neither spoke. But the silence between them had changed shape. It wasn't absence. It was a promise. And in that stillness, something holy stirred, not loud, not sudden, but sure. The kind of sound that only hearts in hiding can truly hear. The summer deepened its breath, stretching heat across the land like a heavy quilt. Dry hollows sweltered in its silence, the sky unbroken for weeks, the earth cracked in lines like old sorrow. Dust rose with every wagon, every step. Nothing bloomed, not truly, except the space between two porches. She had begun sweeping hers each morning before the sun crested the hills. Not out of duty. Not anymore. There was care in it now. A deliberate gesture, like washing grief off old wood. Her wrists still bore faint bruises, her lips still healed slow, but she stood straighter, spoke clearer. No longer a shadow, but something learning to step into light. Across the road, he rose early too. The cowboy with a voice that rarely left his chest. He fed his horse, mended a fence, trimmed the wild hedge climbing his window, always in full view of her porch. Some mornings, he'd place something small on the edge of his railing. A single feather. A smooth stone. A folded page from an old calendar, dates scratched out but a wildflower drawn in the corner. She never touched them. Not in view. But by dusk, the railing would be empty. One morning, she brought out a pie and placed it between them, on the border where porch met road. No note. Just a tin plate, steam curling from the crust. A kind of question. By sundown, the pie was gone, and in its place, a small wooden carving, a sparrow, wings half lifted. She ran her fingers over its surface for a long time. And for the first time since he had seen her, she smiled without shame. But peace in Dry Hollow never lasted. The in-laws watched, and what they saw brewed bitterness. Whispers turned to warnings. The brother, red-faced and swelling with pride, stormed down to the saloon and swore that no woman of his blood would shame the family name by courting a man who carved birds and stared too much. That night, a rock shattered the cowboy's window. He didn't flinch. Just lit a lantern, stood at the broken glass, and stared out until whoever had thrown it felt small enough to disappear. She appeared on her porch the next morning, jaw tight, hands clenched. The bruises were gone, but the trembling had returned. He stood on his own porch. For the first time in weeks, he didn't sit. He waited. And then she crossed the road, barefoot, carrying a mug of coffee like it was a peace offering from a battlefield. She stopped at the bottom of his steps, the rising sun catching in her hair, and said, barely above a whisper, "I don't know what you see in me." He answered slowly, carefully, "I see someone still standing." She blinked, as if unsure how to carry words like that. Then, "They say you don't talk much." He nodded. "I don't waste words." She looked at the cup, then at him. "You don't waste kindness either." He stepped aside, offering her the bench. She sat. He sat beside her, a full hand span apart, but closer than they'd ever been. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. She asked about his wife. He told her about the winter she died. About the way her hands had always smelled of sage and how she once mended a hawk's wing for 3 days straight before letting it go. "I wasn't enough for her sorrow," he said. She turned to him, gently. "You don't owe people healing. You just owe them presence." He looked at her then, not her bruises, not her past. Just her. As if he was seeing the shape of a soul rebuilding itself. The in-laws came at dusk. The sister, cold as always, stood at the bottom of the cowboy's porch and declared that if the widow did not return home at once, she'd be reported to the sheriff as a thief, a whore, and worse. The brother stood behind, arms crossed, jaw clenched. The widow rose, slow but sure. She walked down the steps and stood between them, and him. This time, she didn't flinch. "I live where I'm safe," she said. "And I ain't safe with you." The sister scoffed, called her ungrateful. The brother reached for her arm. But the cowboy moved. Not quickly, just with finality. He stepped forward, eyes steady, body calm. The air thickened. Even the trees held their breath. He didn't threaten, didn't curse. He simply said, "You touch her again, and the law'll come. I'll make sure of it." And in his voice was a weight even the in-laws recognized. The weight of a man who'd buried more than love and survived it. They left in silence. The town saw. And the town began to shift. Miss Liddy brought over a pie the next day. Young Eli offered to carry firewood. Even Mr. Darby nodded at her in the mercantile without the usual tightness in his mouth. But kindness doesn't erase fear. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat on her porch, arms wrapped around her knees. He stepped outside too, rocking slow. Finally, she crossed the road again, sat beside him. She whispered, "I don't know how to trust it." The quiet, the good, feels like a trick. He didn't speak. He reached into his coat, pulled out a scrap of paper. On it, scrawled in plain ink, "Not a trick. Just a long time coming." She read it, and for the first time, she cried. Not from pain, from release. In the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming, and with it, change. The storm didn't roar in like some angry beast. It crept, slow, deliberate, heavy with warning. Clouds hung thick above Dry Hollow, blackening the sky long before noon. Wind twisted through alleys and fields, carrying with it the scent of something unsettled. Not just in weather, in people. She stood at her porch, skirts caught in the restless breeze, eyes on the road. Her hand tightened on the rail, knuckles white. She'd heard the whispers. That her in-laws were planning something. That they'd met with the sheriff the day before. That her presence in town was becoming a moral problem. Across the road, he stood at his own porch, motionless, as if his stillness might somehow calm the shifting world around them. The cowboy's eyes hadn't left her all morning. He felt it too. The gathering. By midday, the church bell rang without reason. 3 times. Not a call to prayer. A warning. Folks began drifting into the street, quiet and uneasy, like the town itself had caught fever. Then they came. The in-laws. Marching down the muddy lane, soaked boots, faces carved from pride and anger. The brother led, flanked by 2 farmhands with stiff shoulders and guilty eyes. The sister followed close, holding a folded paper, official-looking, stained at the corners. Behind them, Sheriff Murdoch trailed on horseback, face unreadable beneath the brim of his badge-stamped hat. They stopped at her porch. The widow did not retreat. She stood taller than she ever had, though her chest rose quick with breath. Her hands did not shake. Not this time. The sister held up the paper like a weapon. "We've had enough," she said. "You're not a part of our family. You were never meant to stay." The brother took a step forward. "You've made yourself a problem. You're drawing attention we don't need. You're going with us. Out of town. Today." She didn't speak. "Not yet." "Sheriff," she asked quietly, "do I have a choice?" The sheriff shifted in his saddle, jaw tight. "Law says they can escort you back if the house is in their name." She didn't look away. "Then I guess the house owns me too." The brother reached out, bold now, fingers closing around her arm. That's when the cowboy moved. Fast, but not reckless. Deliberate. He crossed the road like thunder itself had summoned him. The people of Dry Hollow, all watching from porches, windows, storefronts, fell to silence. He stepped onto her porch, the boards creaking under his weight, and stood between her and the brother. "Don't touch her again," he said. The brother laughed, bitter and loud. "She's our responsibility. She's shaming the family, sleeping under your eyes like some stray mutt. We're taking her." No. That one word cut sharper than any blade. The cowboy looked not at the brother, nor the sheriff, but at the widow. And he said, "She's my wife now." The words cracked the world wide open. Gasps rose from the watching crowd. The widow blinked, once, like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her lips parted, but no sound came. He turned to her gently. "If you'll have me, no rush, no pressure. Just an offering, steady as rain." Her heart broke open in her chest, not from fear, not from pain, but from something she had not dared hope for, a choice. She nodded. Small. Certain. Yes. The sheriff dismounted, stepping forward. "Is that legal?" Miss Liddy emerged from the crowd, voice sharp as truth. "I'm ordained. I got a Bible and a front room. That's legal enough for Dry Hollow." The brother sputtered. "You can't just marry her." "You gave her up the day you laid a hand on her," the cowboy said. "And I won't let you take her again." The sheriff held up a hand. "That's enough." To the brother, "You got no hold on her now. Let her be." For a long second, no one moved. Then the brother stepped back, spat on the porch. You'll regret this. The cowboy's eyes didn't leave him. I already regret not stopping you sooner. The in-laws left under a sky ready to break. And Dry Hollow, for the first time, exhaled. They married that night in Miss Liddy's parlor, standing side by side in silence that hummed with truth. No flowers. No crowd. Just her hand in his, and the kind of vows that don't need to be spoken. Promises carved in quiet gestures, in watching and waiting, in staying. After the final word, he draped his coat over her shoulders and led her outside into the wind. The storm hadn't yet broken, but the clouds swirled low, full of held breath. They walked, hand in hand, down the middle of the street. Not hiding. And the town, Dry Hollow, once mute with indifference, watched them pass like pilgrims. Some touched their hats. Some wiped their eyes. At the edge of town, he stopped. You sure? She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I've never been more sure of anything. They returned to his cabin, where a small lamp waited in the window and the air smelled of cedar and something new. She stepped across the threshold like it was holy ground. He didn't kiss her. He didn't touch her cheek. He just held the door open and let her walk in ahead of him, like it was her home now too. That night, the storm finally broke, thunder rolling like drums of old battles, lightning carving the sky. They sat on the porch, wrapped in his old coat, watching the rain fall heavy on the dirt, washing everything clean. And in the hush between thunderclaps, she whispered, I never thought someone would choose me. He rested his hand over hers. I didn't choose you. I recognized you. She looked at him, this quiet man who had done what no one else dared, and the tears she'd buried for years came without shame. The storm howled, and inside their silence, something wild and tender bloomed. And now, if you're listening, you out there with bruises no one sees, walking through a world that keeps turning its back, let me say this plain. Sometimes it takes a long time for the right soul to find you. But it will. And when it does, may it see your strength, your survival, your worth. Just like he saw hers. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.